Hey guys, Akariss here, bringing you another Fire Emblem Heroes video. So this is a very common question I've had lately on many channels here, Discord, Twitch, whatever, and we're going to be covering defense legendaries, or rather, legendaries used on AR defense. My take on it, and which ones you should, could, and how about you use them. So, enjoy the video.
Let the lesson begin.
Alright guys, welcome back. So today's video is going to talk about the legendaries, but more specifically legendaries in Aether Raids Defense. Now, if you've watched some of my content or heard my response on this sort of thing, I'll tell you right away, I'm not a big fan of legendaries on defense, and especially with like Sigurd being released and Lilina before that, those are very powerful legendaries on defense. But the biggest reason I don't support the idea of using legendaries on defense is because it makes your defense inconsistent. And what that really means is like you may have a knockout season because of your legendary, and then like the seasons where you cannot afford to use them because they have to be in season to get both the blessing benefits, like the stats, but also the lift loss because they count as bless, ends up with a fairly, in my opinion, very inconsistent defense. And this is through my experience of using legendary Azura, Gunnthra, and even Alm sometimes. So like these legendaries, they sometimes are like, wow, they're really good. And then you realize as soon as you can't use them, it really messes up with the consistency of your defense. This is my biggest issue with using them on defense. But at the end of the day, if you can use them and you know like what the backup plan is when your defense doesn't use them, go for it. Okay, so and it really helps as well when it comes to blessings as well. Like you can kind of sub in through different seasons. Let's say in Earth you throw in like Claude, and then in Fire you use Lilina, and then in Water you use Chrom or something. And by doing something like that, you might be able to create this sort of consistency based on the seasons rotating. If you can do something like that and it feels like your defense is always working, awesome. But nonetheless, I will talk about the legendaries on defense here, which I feel are the best of the list that we have here. You'll notice the table doesn't have Sigurd, but we are going to talk about Sigurd. He's just not here. Anyways, so yeah, let's begin. There is a lot of sturdy impact in this video. I'm going to preface that. Sturdy impact is very good. But anyways, let's start. So starting off with probably the most obvious, most used, and probably the oldest of legendaries to be used on defense is Azura, and she's still very good. I do recommend using her in most water seasons, depending on what your team layout is, because of her Grey Waves effect. She doesn't really fit into cavalry teams because she doesn't give bonus movement to cavalry teams. Her biggest benefit is Grey Waves. I don't even feel like Prayer Wheel is that good, and her buffing in general is that good. What is good about her is additional movement, and that additional movement on a Dancer is still fairly unique to her, although it is kind of replicated by Dual Peony's Gentle Dream and additional kind of orders and jump effects through that. So Azura is good. She does have a place. She can sub out for a couple dancers, but we do have decent dancers nowadays between Triandra, Mirabilis, Eldigan, Dual Peony, even Dual Dorothea or Harmonious Dorothea. So like it does like at the end of the day, she's competing with quite a few good options anyways. So not necessarily a staple on defense teams, but if you can put her in for the extra movement and especially to punish players who attack into it, then or like attack into your team and then try to run, Azura punishes that really well. One thing I want to mention with these builds is, again, they're fairly sample builds. This is not objectively the best build to use in Azura, and that applies for everything else that you see in these videos. And this particular video in general with legendaries. Use what you got, make it work, synergize with your team. Don't assume that this is the best thing you can use on defense. Everyone has different cases, right? Okay, next up is Chrom. Actually, I'm surprised I don't see him as much as I think I should see him. I do see him sometimes, but the thing is, his weapon isn't actually as good on air defense as it is in arena. And the reason for that is because he may not be the biggest nuke, and he may not always get the effect of his weapon, which removes penalties from himself and also reduces attack and defense of enemies. So if another unit was to attack before him, and especially because of Change Fate, his weapon may do absolutely nothing. In some cases, that would make something like Slaying Bow potentially better, or even Spendthrift on him, and those are decent options. However, I do feel like if you use an archer, and there will be a few of them covered here, Deadeye and Times Pulse, if applicable, is really good to use regardless of the archer, because there is plenty of damage reduction in the game. People opt for it, and you should be prepared to counter it. Next up is Dimitri. Again, another unit I feel like I should see more on defense, but again, seasons, right? You can't always see these characters. Believe it or not, Dimitri is like kind of built for defense with his kit. It feels like he is, because Odd Tempest, Atrocity, Sturdy Impact, and Slaying, and Damage Reduction all just come in like this one complete package, and Dimitri can be put on defense fairly easily as a melee threat. The thing is, melee threats in general aren't always that good, because they might not have reach. But considering he has Odd Tempest, and if you could combine him with other units on your team that have high danger area, and he can follow up post dance, he's likely to do a lot of work. However, Atrocity assumes your opponent is over 50%, and therefore it may not always get that true damage benefit. And Odd Tempest implies that he wants to engage on turn 1 or 3. So there is a little bit of in that, but he does have a kit that really lends well to a defense team setup. Next up is Lucina, the Wind Legendary. So I covered the water ones. I feel those are the best options for water. Wind Legendaries, Lucina, I believe is like basically my biggest nemesis on defense. Future Vision is a more aggressive version of Change Fate. In case you didn't know, Swap will give you an extra movement forward as opposed to Change Fate, which would keep Chrom in the same position where he used it. So essentially, Lucina ends up having up to like 5 or potentially more movement post Future Vision, which is insane and really creates scenarios where you don't have much space. I feel like if Lucina ends up getting a Future Vision 2 and then ends up even more powerful, we might see a revival of her. At the time being, she's just kind of limited by stats and a lack of effect on her preference weapon. Again, subbing that out for like Slaying or Spendthrift is always an idea, but at the end of the day, she's not really winning in any of the stat criteria here, mostly being attack, and even speed is kind of lacking. But generally, that Future Vision is extremely powerful, and when and if it does get upgraded, Lucina can definitely be one of the best defense units I could see coming. Next up is Gunnthra. Now, Gunnthra is coming out with Chilling Seal 2 soon, and that does synergize really well with her Blizzard tome. However, she doesn't need that, and you can easily use something like a low attack res, low speed res, and that'll work just fine. However, the best way that I feel Gunnthra fits onto defense teams, and this from my experience of using her, is to litter your defense team with so much chills, schools, panics, debuffs everywhere. And if you do that, Gunnthra is one of the better users to go for a pure one-shot when she ends up getting like plus 30 to plus 40 attacks, similar to Ursula, but green. And therefore, Gunnthra is a solid unit there. With Chilling Seal 2, this would make her even more consistent, I feel. But the reason I stopped personally using Gunnthra in my defense teams, and if you watch my replay video tomorrow or in a few days when I upload it, Gunnthra is actually in there right now. But the reason I find her pretty inconsistent, and most users that depend on penalties in general, is that there's actually quite a few units that punish penalties nowadays. You got your negate penalty options, and you even have your unity skills and so forth. And those particular units tend to punish this playstyle or this type of nuke pretty well. Okay, jumping into the most recent Wind Legendary, and this one has had a lot of debate on it. Yes, Sigurd is really good on defense. And for this reason stated in the beginning, I don't feel like you should totally rely on his gimmick, because you cannot replicate it. You cannot have a substitute for him. Similar to Gunnthra, like Gunnthra is like green Ursula, so you can kind of sub out for Ursula. But with Sigurd, what are you going to do when it's not win season? If your defense is winning because of Sigurd, how are you going to replicate this in an off-win season? So that's my biggest problem with him, but that doesn't dismiss that he's really good on defense, because he threatens even more danger area. He essentially has the same threat as a ranged cav, but being melee. And that's great because, well, not everything can counterattack against melee or survive against melee, or in general just survive this guy, because he just has extremely high damage reduction. His Crusader's Ward, Hallowed Turfing combined with Holy Knight Aura, and just damage like crazy. Now, I feel like Quick Impulse is also a solid option in Seal. Again, don't look at the builds and think they're the best. Adapt to what you have, right? Distant Counter is even an option if you think he potentially needs to frontline, and I guess you think people will snipe him. So there's ways to play it, but Sigurd acting like a range cav that has melee damage, attacking into close range is a really good boon. So yeah, I mean, with rally traps and certain maps like Springwater, Sigurd is going to look pretty good. I'm not going to share any particular map setups yet because I don't think I have seen any that really use it well, but if you do see it, it will likely be featured in a later Aether Raids offense commentary, or possibly a defense team if I ever choose to use Sigurd, but I don't have him, and I don't feel like I will or use him, so for now that's not really an issue, but he has a place. Next up is Alm in Earth Season, or the Earth Legendaries in general. Alm is still really good, and I feel will probably always be pretty good because he just does true damage, and true damage is always good. Wind Sweep is a solid option in the B skill as well, if you feel like no one else is doing that on your team. Fire Sweep or Dazzle, respectively. Luna Arc, Lunar Flash, or potentially Luna are all good, solid things to use for Alm. He's still aged really well, and he will get a lot of work done. Not much more to say to that, though. He is what he is. Deadeye is also an option if you feel like damage reduction tanks are giving your team a problem. Next up is Claude. Claude is really good because he's the only flyer with no follow-up. Impact is really good. 30 impact. Pretty much half of the characters I'm featuring here will use that. Fallen Star is really good. Now, because he has damage reduction, I feel like HP scales really well on him. So I feel like if you're going to make him really annoying on defense, HP seals are good. HP attack seal, for example, will be really good on Claude because damage reduction, your effective health is coming through your health points as opposed to your defense or res points. And the thing with Claude is he might want a speed boon instead of an attack boon, but with Deadeye he might want attack. So these are all things to consider. But Claude is a menace when I see him on defense and almost forces the players to use a player phase strategy to beat him in some manner or another. Gale Force, Vantage, PvE, AoE special teams, whatever. This guy on defense is a nightmare to deal with. I'm glad I don't see him as much as... Okay, so Julia is interesting here because she's one of the few legendaries who probably really relies on a special. But the thing is, if you work her into a team that can make an AoE special work for her, she's going to have a 100% win rate against most units in the game. Because if you haven't noticed, a 74 attack base attack unit at +1 without any mythics here, and considering Virtuous Naga and Light and Dark are all going to be in effect, Julia essentially wins most attack versus res checks to get that AoE special blasting through units. The problem is, of course, the threat of pulse smoke, and therefore the inconsistency also with Earth Season having to be in season. So Julia is a monstrous threat on defense, also has effectiveness against dragons, which is just a little bit of a bonus, but she ends up creating a huge stat swing between her attack and the enemy res, and that is why I fear seeing her. And probably one of the few things, if you still run Infantry Pulse, she's definitely a solid consideration there. Next up is Hector. And Hector is still very unique because Osteo's Pulse hits not just, like, it doesn't just pulse infantry units, it can pulse calves, and it can pulse flyers and armors as well. So he's very unique in that aspect, and I feel like once he gets a Legendary Remix buff, Osteo Pulse 2 could get even more insane. Now, the thing with Hector, though, is, again, the Fire Season limitation and him just being an armor, and now he can't even really benefit from, like, save skills because the Osteo Pulse is occupied in the C slot. However, he does have some pretty good synergy with Legendary Lilina, who we will cover in a moment, and they're both in the same season, and Legendary Lilina can definitely run an AoE special thanks to Daddy. So those are some things to consider, but nonetheless, he's mostly a dead unit, and everything you kind of get out of him is Osteopulse for sure. Next up is Celica. Now, this is another unit that feels like it should see more presence because similar to Alm, she's always going to do damage thanks to Saintly Seraphim. She also runs null follow-up and potentially a desperation out of that null follow-up combined in her B slot. people who tend to use Bolt Tower or some sort of AoE splash damage can really basically die to Celica really fast because they don't see that coming in a way. And Sturdy Impact, Sturdy Blow here, as shown, can actually make her survive a Brave Hector, and because she's running no follow-up, will likely kill him. So one of the better answers to that. She's still going to have some relevance even against other green tanks and red tanks because of her true damage built in. But there isn't really that much more going for her, and she's essentially just a really strong green mage nuke. And finally, as mentioned just a moment ago, Legendary Lilina recently released. Now, Legendary Lilina's AoE special is a 0.8 times multiplier as opposed to the Blazing specials that use 1.5 times. However, if you were to special accelerate her using Daddy, Osteus Pulse, Quick Impulse, potentially Grand Scratcher, you can use an AoE special at 1.5 times. And similarly to Legendary Julia, +1 74 base attack is pretty good. Yes, you may lose some of that attack if you drop out Life and Death and whatnot, but she's a ranged cav, therefore has a bigger threat, danger zone, danger area. And if you even give her Wind Sweep, she's not really going to care about Weapon Triangle because most of the prominent big tanks are using stuff that they cannot counter through Wind Sweep, and she has enough speed to compete with most of those. Now, Lilina is really good, and that's already been shown. There's plenty of layouts where I've had to really think about how to play into her. If she uses a Blazing special from other special acceleration, it's really good. However, Pulse Smoke does give her some problems if a tank can get in there to hit her through that. Combinations with save skills, though, really make Lilina shine. Okay guys, that basically covers all the legendaries I want to talk about in today's video. If I didn't cover one, it's probably because you probably shouldn't use them on defense, or they're far too niche to get any value. I could see more being added to this list, so maybe we'd have a follow-up video in the future if needed, but in general, all other legendaries, it wouldn't really use them on defense, unless maybe it's their bonus season, or you're really hating on, let's say, dragons and thought that Legendary Mars being on your defense would be a good option. Thank you guys for watching as always. If you want to help out the channel, thumbs up always helps. Subscribe if you haven't already. Let me know in the comments below which legendary you have the most success with, and I will see you guys in the next one. Much love, guys. Peace.
It's over.